So my name is Pete Koomen, and I am the co-founder and CTO of a company called Optimizely. And I'm going to tell a story today that starts right here. This is a blog post that was written a couple years ago by one of our customers entitled, "How Optimizely Almost Got Me Fired." And this story it's a little bit about statistics. We're going to talk a little bit about statistics. But mostly it's about how to make a hard decision when you're trying to grow a company. It's a story of a hard decision that we had to make. Before I actually get into the details of the blog post, it's worth rewinding for a second, and I'll tell you a little bit about Optimizely. So we started our company about 6 years ago now. My co-founder and I started it out of his living room, and we make it really easy to run A/B tests on your website and mobile applications. Now, the inspiration for Optimizely came out of my co-founder Dan's experience on the Barack Obama campaign in 2008. Dan and his team ran dozens of A/B tests on barackobama.com in an attempt to make it more effective for online fundraising. And they were super successful. So they broke every record in the book. They raised hundreds of millions of dollars in donations. And they did a lot of that through A/B testing. So an A/B test is a very simple concept. It's an experiment you can run with your website. And so here's a really simple example. This is an experiment that they ran on barackobama.com. On the left, you have variation A. On the right, you have variation B. And in the experiment, they showed 50% of their traffic, variation A, and 50% of their traffic, variation B, and they measured which image on the home page got more people to sign up. So it's a scientific experiment designed to improve your marketing. It's a very simple concept. And we got together, we started a couple of companies that failed, and we looked back at Dan's experience on the Obama campaign and sort of said to ourselves, A/B testing was extremely valuable, but it was also hard to do. I wonder if we can design a better way to do this. And that's where Optimizely came from. And in a nutshell, we sell decisions. We make it easier for our customers to make data-driven decisions. And this is important. It'll come up again. But back to the blog post. So how did we almost get this marketer fired at one of our customers? Well, this company ran what's called an AA test with Optimizely. So in an A/B test, you test one thing against a different thing, and you try to figure out which of those two things is better. In an AA test, you test something against itself. Now, why would anybody want to run an AA test? Well, usually it's because they're trying to test their A/B testing software. They want to make sure that Optimizely is working correctly. And so this customer tested their homepage against itself, and they got these results. So the results of this experiment said that A was 18% better than A. Probably raised some eyebrows. And what's worse, if you look all the way on the right-hand side, you'll see a number that we title Chance to Beat Baseline. And what that means is that Optimizely was 100% confident that A was better than A. That raised a lot of eyebrows. And of course, they started asking a lot of questions, and they eventually fired us and wrote a blog post about how Optimizely almost got this guy fired. And they wrote some theories about why this was going wrong, and it turns out that theories weren't exactly correct. But we passed this around. This made the rounds around the office. And of course, we had kind of an oh shit moment. What was actually going on here? And I had that moment too, because I actually wrote this code that generated the Chance to Beat Baseline several years earlier. And we wanted to understand what was actually happening here. And so we sat down with some statisticians from Stanford. And turns out the answer was really, really interesting. It's helpful to understand what we were using to calculate that Chance to Beat Baseline number. We were using a statistical test called the t-test. Many of you may be familiar with this. It's probably the most popular statistical test used to make data-driven decisions. And it's really simple. It's probably why it's so popular. It's got 3 steps. So when you run a t-test, You start by running your experiment. So you test A against B. Doesn't matter if A and B are two different web pages, or if they're two different laundry detergents or fertilizers. You run your experiment, and then you look at the results of your experiment. And then you ask yourself a simple question. You ask, what are the odds that the results that I just got from this experiment are a fluke? So what are the odds that these results were but just by random chance alone? And those odds, you can calculate them. That's known as the p-value. So the higher those odds, the higher the p-value, the more likely it is that you're just staring at statistical noise. And the lower the p-value, the more likely that you have a statistically significant difference between A and B, which is what you're trying to figure out. You're trying to find a winner. And the convention at this point is that if your p-value is less than 5%, your results are significant. Why 5%? It's just kind of a convention, right? This test is used all over. It's not just used in marketing or A/B testing. It's used in academia. It's used everywhere. 5% is a commonly used threshold for statistical significance. In order to understand why this was actually breaking down in Optimizely, it's helpful to understand where this t-test came from. The t-test was invented in 1908. Believe it or not, it was actually invented by somebody who was working for Guinness, the brewing company. And it's known as the student t-test because the person who created the t-test didn't want their competitors knowing that they were running these kinds of analyses. And so he published it under a pseudonym, student. And anyway, the t-test has some assumptions baked into it. And it really only works if those assumptions are true. And those assumptions made sense in 1908 when the t-test was invented. It made sense because in 1908, data was expensive and data was slow, right? If you're running an agricultural experiment, you're trying to test two fertilizers against each other. It takes you months and a lot of work to collect a set of data. If you want to collect more data after that, you might have to wait a whole other year to collect more data. And more importantly, in 1908, by and large, your practitioners are trained. So if you're running an experiment in 1908, chances are that you're a doctor or you're a scientist and you've had some statistical training. Now contrast that with today. Data is cheap, and for the most part, data is real time. Right? We're all used to analytics that are spitting out real-time data all the time. And now practitioners are everyone. Everybody's making data-driven decisions these days, and that's a good thing, but most people who do this kind of thing don't have statistical training. And that comes into play here. And it comes into play because the t-test was designed for the world on the left and not the world on the right. So as I said before, there's a set of assumptions that the t-test bakes in that aren't always followed anymore. And the end result is that you have a set of pitfalls that are very easy to fall into when you're using the t-test to make a statistical decision. I'm going to talk about each one of these. I'm going to just give a short example of each one. And these pitfalls are, number one, stopping early, making a decision without enough data. Two, peaking. This is where it starts to get weird. It turns out that just looking at your results while your experiment is going on can cause you to get more errors. And finally, testing multiple hypotheses. And once you learn about these things and understand them, it's amazing how often you see them in the world. So pitfall number one, I'm going to use an example well outside of the A/B testing world. I'll use a story that broke around this time last year. Some of you may have seen this. A whole bunch of news outlets wrote about a study that found that people who exercise strenuously, who are strenuous runners, had the same mortality rate as people who didn't run at all. So the conclusion was that running hard was deadly, right? BBC wrote about it. Telegraph wrote about it. Bloomberg Business. New York Times picked it up. And of course, my favorite source for scientific news, Cosmo, wrote a story, is too much running bad for you. Now, if you're like most people, you might have seen this, you might have made a mental note, running fast is going to kill me, probably should tone down my exercise a little bit, and thought nothing more of it. But a writer named Alex Hutchinson at Runner's World took a closer look, and all he did was look at the paper that this study was published in. And he just looked at the numbers that the scientists had published in that paper. And here are the numbers they used to draw this conclusion. So on the right-hand side is the size. They followed about 1,000 people for 10 years, and they looked at how many of those people died. And on the right-hand side, you can see the size of each group. And to the left of that, you see how many of those people died over a 10-year period. Right away, you notice a few things weird about these numbers. Well, first, more than a quarter of the sedentary people died over a 10-year period. That's a little alarming. And why is that? Well, if you read the paper, it turns out most of the sedentary people were in their 70s or 80s. That's why they were sedentary. But the scientists who ran the study used what's called an age correction. So they took the ratio at the top and they applied the age correction, and they came out with a mortality rate that looked pretty close to 2 out of 40, which is the same mortality rate as the strenuous group. And that brings us to the next weird thing about these numbers. The entire conclusion of the paper was based on 2 deaths. 2 people out of 40 over a 10-year period died. And as Alex wrote in Runner's World, thank goodness a 3rd person didn't die, or public health authorities would be banning jogging. Now, did these 2 people die in running-related injuries? Did they have heart attacks or something like that? They actually didn't publish how the people died. This was just any deaths over a 10-year period. So anybody who actually looks at these numbers can see this is a pretty flimsy conclusion to draw, and yet it got a ton of attention. There's all sorts of interesting things you can think and talk about to do with the incentives at every step of that stage, with the scientists, with the journalists, with the readers. We don't have time to go into that now, but suffice it to say, the same thing happens in the A/B testing world. It's very easy to run an A/B test, look at the data, very shortly after you start, see, wow, that looks like a dramatic winner. I'm just going to stop and I'm going to make a call. And we saw that our customers were doing that. So that's pitfall number 1. Pitfall number 2, peaking. As I mentioned before, this is where things start to get a little weird, really non-intuitive here. Let's say that you run an experiment on your website. You start your experiment, and now you follow the rules. So the t-test, turns out it only works if you collect enough data to reach what's called a minimum sample size. It's an awkward thing to do, to calculate what your minimum sample size should be. It turns out you have to guess ahead of time what your results are going to be, but if you knew that, why would you be testing anyway? We're not going to get into that. Let's just assume that you're following the rules, though. So you reach your minimum sample size. And once you reach your minimum sample size, you peek at your results. And you notice your p-value is higher than 5%. Your results are not significant. So what do? Well, if you're a statistician, you stop. But if you're like most marketers, you say, well, I'll just leave this test running for another day, and I'll check it the next day. And maybe you check your results again the next day, and you still don't have significant results. So you check it again the next day. And you check it the next day, and lo and behold, your p-value is less than 5%. You have a statistically significant winner. And what's even better is that the t-test guarantees that you are less than 5% likely to be making a bad decision here. That's the beauty of the t-test, right? Well, unfortunately not. It turns out that looking at the results 4 times will increase your error rate from 5% to close to 18%. And the more that you look at your results, if you're using the t-test, the worse your error rate gets. And this is where it starts to get really unintuitive. How can just looking at the results during an experiment cause you to get higher errors? Well, the problem is not just that you're looking at it. Each time you look at the results, you're making a decision on whether to stop or keep going. So in effect, you're waiting for statistical significance to happen. And that's very similar to staring at a broken clock, waiting for it to tell the right time. There's that old saying, even a broken clock is right twice a day. When you're testing on live data, Data is random, it fluctuates a lot. You are going to, at some point, see statistically significant results. And the t-test works because it assumes you're only going to look at those results once. And of course, that made sense in a world where you're planting a set of crops and waiting several months and then looking at the results. It doesn't make sense in a world where you have real-time data all the time for free. So that's peaking. So pitfall number 3, the last pitfall. Testing multiple hypotheses. So I don't know if any of you are fans of XKCD. It's a brilliant webcomic. It's by Randall Patrick Monroe. I think he's a genius. I'm going to use one of his comics to illustrate this last pitfall. This is another really non-intuitive pitfall. And in this comic strip, he illustrates a couple scientists who are investigating a link between jelly beans and acne. And they run 20 different experiments, and they investigate the link between every single possible jelly bean color and acne. And in 19 of those experiments, they find there's no link between red jelly beans, brown jelly beans, and acne. And in one of those experiments, they do find a link between green jelly beans and acne. It's a statistically significant link. Now, of course, this is what you'd expect, right? If you expect to make a bad decision about 5% of the time, you would expect one of these experiments would show positive results. The problem is the punchline here, and that is the news picks it up as green jelly beans are linked to acne. 95% confidence, right? Same thing happens in A/B testing, because most people don't run simple A/B tests. They run A, B, C, D, E tests. They run 5 variations or 10 variations. Or they run what's known as a multivariate test, where you have a combinatorial explosion, you have dozens or hundreds of variations. And for each of those variations, they look at many different metrics to try to decide who the winner is. And the problem is that although the customer, the marketer, thinks of this as one A/B test, the t-test treats every single combination of variation and metric as a separate A/B test. So the t-test thinks that you're running hundreds of different A/B tests at the same time. And of course, you'd expect some percentage of those to show you false positive results. And that's a problem. So, we look at how our users are actually using our software, and we notice this problem. And here it is in a nutshell. The t-test only works when users follow the rules. Most users don't understand the rules. So users see more false positives than they should. Users are making decisions with our software that are not as good as they think they're going to be. And this is our reaction. We suddenly realize that the thing we've built is less useful than we thought it was. So what do we do about this? Well, it's worth noting at this point that we're not the only ones making this mistake, right? Every commercial A/B testing software package out there also uses, at this time, the t-test to make decisions. And we basically lay out 3 options. And I'm going to enumerate them here in terms of how risky they are. First option, ignore it. Just kind of pretend it doesn't exist and hope the problem goes away. Second option, fix it quietly. So build a fix to this problem and kind of push it out there, but don't say anything about it. Now, why is this more risky than ignoring it? It's more risky because in order to fix the problem, we actually have to make it harder to find winners with Optimizely. And why do people buy Optimizely? Because they're trying to make decisions. They're trying to find winners. So in order to fix the problem, we actually have to make our software harder to use. That's risky. It could impact our finances. Or lastly, fix it loudly. So fix the problem and talk about it. Be open about the fact that we were screwing up. This is the riskiest one of all, because not only are we making it harder to use our product, we're also openly admitting that we've been screwing up for years. So we're talking about values at this point. When we started Optimizely, shortly after that point, we wrote down a set of values for the company. This has come in, it's turned out to be so important so many times, I can't say enough. how important it is to do this. And our values are ownership, passion, trust, integrity, fearlessness, and transparency. This is Optify. It's important because it gives all of our employees a framework for hiring employees and for making decisions. And if we look back at our 3 options here, and we graph them according to how well they align with our values, well, ignore it doesn't look so attractive anymore. It's a low integrity option. Fixing it quietly, it's higher integrity. We're fixing the problem at least, but we're not being transparent with our customers. Finally, fixing it loudly. We're being high integrity, we're being high transparency. Now I want to stress here that I think it's easy as an outsider to look at a set of decisions like this and say, well, I'd make the same decision. It's obvious, you do the right thing. But when you're talking about making a decision with hundreds of people and wanting to get everybody aligned on that, especially when it's a decision that could cause some of our salespeople to have lower bonuses, that could cause material financial harm to our company, it's not so easy to do. And that's why it's so valuable to align on a framework for making these kinds of hard decisions. So it's so valuable to write down your values. And that's what we chose. So we built something called Stats Engine. This is a modern approach to statistical decision making. We designed a web page, we published a paper about it, we wrote a blog post, we talked to everybody we could about it. And the response was almost uniformly positive. Across the board, we got the reaction, we thought there was an issue. We've seen this problem with a lot of different A/B testing packages. We're so glad Optimizely took a leadership position and started talking openly about it. A blog post written by an influencer in the space, how Optimizely will kill your winning percentage and why that's a great thing for you. Finally, the sincerest form of flattery, we notice our competitors starting to create imitation features as well. So they started changing their approach to statistics too, and we think that's a good thing too, because the more trustworthy the A/B testing industry is, the better we all do. So wrapping this up with a few lessons learned. First one, I'm a product guy. This one's close to home for me. In product design, empathy is better than expertise any day of the week, right? We were correct in our implementation of the t-test. All of our formulas are correct, but it wasn't until we actually observed how our users were using the product that we understood the gap. Second, own your mistakes. Anyone who has started a company knows that you will find a lot of very creative ways of screwing up. And we have screwed up just about every way possible in the past 6 years. And I have found over and over again that to inspire trust in your customers, be transparent about it. If your customers trust that you understand your problems, they will trust you to fix them. And finally, when making hard decisions, data beats intuition any day of the week, but values beat data any day of the week. So write them down. Write them down early and reinforce them over and over again. So thank you.